or these orthodox histories would tell the history of American economic development. And it was always from the standpoint of the industrialists, heroes, Carnegie, Rockefeller, Morgan, they were the ones who made America great. But these histories did not say anything about the people who worked in Rockefeller's oil refineries, or the people who worked in Carnegie steel mills, the people who worked on the railroads, the Irish immigrants, Chinese immigrants, worked long hours, low pay, died in large numbers, These people were omitted from the histories. And I had been brought up in a working class family. I had gone to work at the age of 18 in a shipyard, usually with middle class families, or certainly upper class families. If you were 18, you went to college. But if you were a working class family, at the age of 18, you went to work. So I went to work in a shipyard. So I became interested in working people, and I was reading, and I was organizing in the shipyard with some other young workers. And so I was conscious of working people, and I was interested in the labor movement. And so I wanted to write a history of the United States that would bring in the working people and bring in the struggles of the working people, the great strikes. I was teaching history. I was teaching American history. And I was looking for a book that would represent my point of view. And this was in the 1970s. This was after the social movements of the 1960s. And the social movements of the 1960s created a desire for a different point of view than the orthodox, the traditional textbooks. And because now, after the civil rights movement, after the Vietnam War, people were more critical of the United States government. More critical of domestic policy, more critical of foreign policy, but there were no books on American history, textbooks, or no general histories of the United States that reflected that new idea, that new criticism.
Who are you, Howard Zinn? Are you a radical?
I hope so. Well, the word radical is very often misused, in the United States. They only have a very vague idea of what radical means. And sometimes they talk about the radical right, you see. And they use the word radical to mean extreme, you see. But to me, the word radical means, getting to the root of a problem, going deeper than the usual criticism. For instance, here's the difference between a liberal point of view and a radical point of view. The radical point of view would say, no more going through employers or insurance companies, free health care for everybody. That's a radical point of view. Well, here's another example. Today, I'll take an example from today. A liberal point of view is, the war in Iraq is not going well. There's a better way to fight it. You see. We'll bring in other countries. So we'll bring in...
That's the Kerry approach.
That's the Kerry approach, exactly. That's John Kerry's approach. Let's bring in the United Nations. The logic is strange. If the war is immoral, let more people join the immoral war, you see. The radical point of view says, if the war is immoral, get out of Iraq, stop the war. And we faced the same situation during the Vietnam. The Vietnam period was something unprecedented in American history. I mean, nothing like this had ever happened. By that I mean there had been no movement against a war so widespread, so great as during the Vietnam period. We had always had, in the wars fought by the United States, we'd always had dissenters, rebels, who protested against the war. Even the Revolutionary War, the Mexican War in 1846-48, where the United States took almost half of Mexico in that war. There were American soldiers who deserted. They refused to fight. And, and so on. World War I, great opposition. Even in World War II, which is supposed to be, it's called the Good War, World War II. Even in World War II, there were people who said war is not the way, They went to prison. But never had there been a movement against the war as great, as strong as the movement against the war in Vietnam. It started slow, it started small. In fact, at the beginning, it was little demonstrations took place. And people said, we will never win. We cannot stop the United States government. The United States government is too powerful. This is the greatest military machine on earth. How can we stop them? But the movement grew. It grew and grew and grew.
Because American people were dying in Vietnam? That's the reason?
For, I think, several reasons. Yes, because American people were dying. But I don't think that's the only reason. Because if that were the only reason, that would mean that Americans did not care what happened to the people of Vietnam. And it's true that the government of the United States did not care what happened to the people of Vietnam. Well, in fact, the government did not care what happened to the people in the United States, you see. But I think, yes, the casualties, the growing casualties of Americans in Vietnam had a very important effect on the American public. But there was something else, and that was that the American public became more and more aware that the United States was doing terrible things in Vietnam. That they would begin to see pictures on television of the Marines setting fire to the huts of villages. They would see a big American Marine holding a gun, pointing a gun at a little Vietnamese woman with her children. It was, people were moved by that. And then they learned about the My Lai massacre. They learned a year late about the My Lai massacre because the press is always slow to report those things. But the My Lai massacre was known in 1968, but only in 1969 did it come out in the American press. And then the American people saw these horrible pictures of American soldiers slaughtering hundreds and hundreds of Vietnamese women and children. So it was American lives lost that contributed to the anti-war movement, and also growing realization that what the United States was doing in Vietnam was inhuman and wrong. And also the American people were learning more about the war, learning more about the reasons for the war. They're beginning to see that lies were told to them. We're seeing some of the same things happen now in Iraq. The Pentagon Papers, one of the most, I think, interesting episodes of the Vietnam War, maybe not just one of the most interesting episodes of the Vietnam War, just one of the most interesting episodes in American history, because it was a very rare event where somebody who is high up in the American government suddenly turns around and exposes the secrets of the government. For instance, Anthony Russo, who worked with Daniel Ellsberg, his job with the Rand Corporation was interrogating prisoners, Viet Cong.
I see.
And when he interrogated them, he learned something important that changed his mind about the war. He learned that these people who had been soldiers in the National Liberation Front and the Viet Cong knew what they were fighting for. They understood what the war was about. Whereas the soldiers of the South Vietnamese Army who were working with the United States did not know what the war was about. So this turned him around. Daniel Ellsberg was, he had graduated from Harvard, he had degrees, you know, he was, worked with the State Department and worked with the Rand Corporation, worked with the Department of Defense. He was a Marine in Vietnam and was out in the, and when he was in Vietnam, he saw things that disturbed him about what the United States was doing in Vietnam. And he decided that no, the war is wrong. I mean, he read things like, well, the South Vietnamese government is not an independent government. It is the creation of the United States. He read about the bombing, where the United States was saying, oh, we're only bombing military targets. And they found, no, we're bombing in order to destroy the morale of the civilian population. So anyway, that experience made him decide that he was going to take these secret papers, 7,000 pages.
Oh my God.
7,000 pages. And he was going to photocopy them. Photocopy 7,000 pages and distribute them to the public. So he and his friend Anthony Russo did that secretly. So he was put on trial in Los Angeles, and I was called as a witness for the defense because I had read the Pentagon Papers. And my job was to explain to the jury, this is what's in the Pentagon Papers. And I spoke to the jury for like 5 hours.
5 hours?
You see, giving them the history of the Vietnam War. I mean, these people in the jury were typical Americans. That is, they knew very little about the Vietnam War. And I was telling them this history. Much of it was in the Pentagon Papers. So I testified, and then I was cross-examined, you see. But my job was to tell the jury the history of the Vietnam War and to explain to them why these papers were not harmful to the United States, certainly not harmful to the people of the United States if they were released, but they were embarrassing to the government. And that's why the government wanted them secret.
I see.
So there are differences, but there are very serious similarities. I mean, there's a fundamental similarity. Fundamental similarity is in Vietnam, the United States sent troops and planes halfway around the world to attack a small country that was not threatening the United States. Exactly the same thing in Iraq. Here's this giant country, the United States, with 280 million people. Here's Iraq with 25 million people. And the United States is sending halfway around the world, sending an army to bomb and invade Iraq, when Iraq is no threat to the United States, really no threat to anybody, you see. Maybe to its own people, but not to anybody else. So there's that fundamental similarity between the two situations. And then there are other similarities. In both cases, you might say there was a series of lies told to the American people about Vietnam and now about Iraq. And also in the Vietnam War, the people of the United States slowly began to realize that they were lies. In the United States, also, people have begun to realize that. The time frame is different. The time frame for Iraq is more intense than in Vietnam. In Vietnam, it took several years for people to begin to think that the war was wrong and that that somehow everything that had been told to them was deceiving them. It took time in the Vietnam War. In the Iraq War, it has happened rather quickly. After all, it's only been a year or so that the United States has been at war in Iraq, and already the American people have learned that all this story about weapons of mass destruction was a lie, you see. And so as a result, the anti-war movement in the United States has grown faster in the Iraq situation than it did in Vietnam. Well, I mean, 9/11, as everybody knows, was a catastrophic affair. Nothing like that had happened in the United States, or maybe nowhere in one day, this huge disaster and hijacking, bombs, and buildings blowing up, maybe 3,000 people dying. So it was shocking to the American public. And clearly, yes, terrorists had done this, okay. So Bush had, just become president. He was a new president. Question is, how is Bush going to react to this? He immediately says, we declare a war on terrorism. Now, how can you make a war on terrorism? Terrorism is not a country. It's not a place. Not a country you can say, I'll make war on this place, I will bomb it, and then the terrorists will be defeated. No, the terrorists are everywhere. The point is that terrorism is not something you can fight with a war. So it was clear, at least not to the American public, which was taken in, or the press, which was taken in and accepted this idea of a war on terrorism, but it's clear to many of us that this war on terrorism was just a device, a trick to enable the American public to do something that it wanted to do before 9/11. And what the United States government wanted to do even before 9/11 was to move more power into the Middle East. The war on terrorism is absurd because if you think about it intelligently, you cannot do away with terrorism by bombing this country or that country. The only way you can deal with terrorism is to ask the question, what are the causes of terrorism? What are the roots of terrorism? What is it that motivates these terrorists? After all, this is not the first historical experience with terrorism. There was the IRA, the Irish, Republican Army, they committed acts of terrorism. Well, the British reacted to it like Bush did, with force. That didn't stop the IRA. Finally, the English had to recognize, no, there's something behind the terrorism. There's a real grievance behind the terrorism. The grievance of the IRA is the British are occupying our country. They had to do something about that if they're going to do something about terrorism. Or take the Israeli situation. Terrorism, suicide bombers. So the Israeli government, Sharon, responds to that like Bush does, with force. What does it do? Does it stop the suicide bombers? No, there are more of them. The only way Israel can stop the terrorism is by thinking we have to remove the cause of the terrorism. The cause of the terrorism is the occupation of the Palestinian territories. Only that will stop terrorism. So for the United States, the intelligent thing to do is say, well, what is it that moves these terrorists? Not hard to figure out. United States policy in the Middle East. United States occupation, armies in the Middle East. The United States supporting Israel, which is very important to everybody in the Middle East. And the sanctions that the United States was supporting in Iraq, which was killing hundreds of thousands of people in Iraq. These were grievances, genuine grievances, justified grievances. So if you really cared about terrorism, you would do something about those grievances, but the United States did not want to do anything about these grievances, because then the United States would have to change its foreign policy. Then the United States would have to be a different kind of country. Then the United States would have to withdraw its troops from the Middle East, would have to stop supporting Israel. They don't want to do that. So they create a diversion. The diversion is the war on terrorism. What happened after 9/11 was the same thing that happens every time a crisis is created. The United States goes to war. The United States, when a crisis is created and the United States goes to war, then the government says to the American people, we are in a crisis. This is a special situation. We cannot have our liberties. We cannot have the same freedom of speech. You see, the Constitution has to be put aside. The Bill of Rights has to be put aside because this is an emergency. And so, for the American people, the government said, we're fighting for liberty, we're fighting for democracy. And the government even gives the names to wars. They call this Operation Freedom, Operation Enduring Freedom. They give these, those American people believe in freedom and democracy. You might say everybody believes in freedom and democracy. So the American people are told, we're fighting for freedom and democracy. Okay, it's all right. Here's another thing I think that is very important. And that is the memory of World War II is still very strong in the United States. And World War II was the war which is generally accepted as just, really for freedom and democracy, because it was a war against fascism. Now, the truth is that World War II was not strictly and simply a war for democracy. I mean, after all, who was fighting the fascists? The British Empire, the French Empire, the American Empire, Stalin's Russia. Were they most interested in democracy and liberty? No, they had other interests. But their interests at that time coincided with the interests of the people who wanted to get rid of fascism. World War II is still powerful in the United States. The Good War, it's called, the Good War. And so the government and the press, they draw upon World War II. They make comparisons to World War II. They say, oh, see, in World War II we fought against Hitler. Saddam Hussein is Hitler, another Hitler. In the World War II, we said, we must fight for democracy. Well, here too, we must fight for democracy. So they make these connections with World War II and these analogies. And to take the whatever moral element there was in World War II and transplant it onto every bad, unjust war that we have fought since the end of World War II. It's important to understand why the American people have been slow to understand what is happening in Iraq, why still many Americans think weapons of mass destruction have been found. Totally false. And the reason is that the media in the United States are more controlled now than they were during the war in Vietnam. The television channels, the newspapers, they're now much more concentrated in the hands of a few powerful corporations. And where do American people get their news, their information? They get it from television. In fact, there was a recent survey. They asked American people, what television channel do you watch? And what do you believe about this and that? They found that those people who watched Fox News, Fox News is the right wing and very widely watched. Of those people who watched Fox television news, 80% of them still believe that weapons of mass destruction have been found in Iraq. I mean, it shows the power of the media. And that is what we in the anti-war movement have to struggle against.
en el software de Howard Zinn.
When the Soviet Union collapsed around 1989, 1990, all over the United States, everybody said, this means that socialism is dead. That's the end of socialism. This proves that Marxism is a failure. Well, I didn't believe that. I guess I didn't believe that. First of all, I did not believe that the Soviet Union represented a truly Marxist society. I didn't believe the Soviet Union represented true socialism. There was too much dictatorship, too much bureaucracy, too much destruction of freedom in the Soviet Union. So to me, no, Marxism was not dead now because the Soviet Union was gone. The idea of socialism, to me, is a very important idea. And it's an idea that should be kept alive. And so I thought, well, how am I going to put that on stage? I had written, a few plays before that. I thought, how can I put this idea on stage? Well, I'll bring Marx back to talk. Bring him back from wherever he is. Who knows where he is, you see. But bring him back. And I bring him back to, he lived in Soho, London. But the people who send him back, allow him to come back, whoever they are, some committee, I suppose, they make a mistake. Instead of sending him to Soho in London, where he lived, they send him to Soho in New York.
In New York.
You see. So this gives him an opportunity on stage. It's a one-person play. Karl Marx appears, and he says, I'm here to explain to you what Marxism really is. And I'm going to tell you why the Soviet Union was not really Marxist. And I will also tell you that Marx's ideas about capitalism are still valid, because I am here now in New York and I see people homeless on the streets, and I see how the corporations are controlling the government, and I see how the people are absolutely controlled by television and by the government propaganda, and how there is still a class difference in the United. Yes, Marx's ideas are still alive. And so he comes on stage and has this, these two things he wants to do.
Carlos Marx ha vuelto por un breve espacio de tiempo, pero ha vuelto. Pero les advierto una cosa. Yo no soy marxista. Se lo dije una vez a Piper y por poco revienta. En su momento les hablaré de Piper.
No, he wants to say that the collapse of the Soviet Union did not mean the collapse of socialism. The idea of socialism is still a good one. That the wealth of the world should be distributed equally among the people. And that socialism does not mean dictatorship. It means freedom. It means freedom of expression. And also, I want to say, Marx wants to say that capitalism is absolutely disastrous for most of the people in the society, and it needs to be replaced by a socialist society that will be truly democratic. And the question is, when the United States engages in regime change, what is the result? We can go back to 1898. We can go back to that war against Spain. That was regime change. The United States got rid of Spain. It did not bring freedom to Cuba. It brought American power into Cuba. And of course, in recent history, the United States has tried to change regimes all over the world, including democratically elected regimes in Chile and Guatemala. Regime change. What was the result? Dictatorship, death. And so the American people don't know that history. So they don't, and So the United States, as you say, has always been wanting to have regime change in Cuba, because what has been behind regime change, whenever the United States has engaged in regime change, what has been behind it? Liberty, democracy? No. What's been behind is that the United States has always wanted to have governments that would be subservient to the United States.
Mm-hmm.
And even during the Cold War, when the United States said it just wanted to overthrow communist governments, no, it wasn't just communist governments. Because Chile did not have a communist government, Guatemala did not. No, any government that did not cooperate with the United States, regime change was necessary. So the problem with Cuba is not even that Cuba is Marxist or communist or socialist. The problem is that Cuba insists on being independent of the United States, insists that it will not be subservient. That's the problem with Cuba.
Cuéntame, ¿qué hay detrás de la cima de aquella colina, de aquel arrabal? Dime si hay una playa, si hay una muralla, si hay un arenal. Dime si sobre el mangle no canta el sinsonte. Cuéntame, ¿qué hay detrás de la playa, de aquella muralla, de aquel arenal? Dime si hay un estrecho y los barcos maltrechos por el vendaval. No me digas que no pillas el horizonte. Voilà, yo leí tu nombre en un cartel y aquí estoy con la necesidad de sobrevivir, de seguir en pie. Tiraré, 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 tiraré un collar sobre aquel tablero de ajedrez. Y por cábala adivinarás si te sobra amor, si te falta fe. Cuéntame, ¿qué hay detrás del estrecho y los barcos maltrechos por el vendaval? Dime si hay un país, un matiz de raíz con una capital. Dime si allí no cantan canciones lejanas. ¿Qué hay detrás del país, del matiz de raíz con una capital? Dime si hay una cima, si hay una colina, si hay un arrabal. No preguntes por quién redoblan las campanas.
I think the future relations between Cuba and the United States depends on a few things. You see, first, regime change in the United States. The Bush administration has got to go. While the Bush administration is in power, it will be very hard to change this hard line of the United States, this very, really vicious line of the United States towards Cuba. If Bush is defeated in the next election, John Kerry, it is true, has said he will keep the embargo. You see, so he is not a radical at all. You know, he is about 1 degree to the left of George Bush. But we are depending on that 1 degree. You see, with John Kerry, there's a little possibility that John Kerry can change and that can listen. Bush will not listen. John Kerry may listen to those people in the United States who want the United States to change its policy towards Cuba. So that's the first requirement, the change. And then the second requirement is change in American public opinion. Because so long as the American public has a picture of Cuba, which is given to them by the government and by the press, you know, this tyrannical regime, you know, this dictatorship, and that's the picture that the American people have, that makes it easier for the government to maintain the embargo, you see, the blockade, you see. And so, and as I said before, the Cuban achievements since the revolution are not told to the American people, the remarkable, extraordinary achievements in literacy, education, health, culture, you know, They're not told. So the American people must learn more about Cuba.
Cuéntame, ¿qué hay detrás de la cima de aquella colina, de aquel arrabal? Dime si hay una playa, si hay una muralla, si hay un arenal. Dime si sobre el mangle no canta el sinsonte. Cuéntame, ¿qué hay detrás de la playa, de aquella muralla, de aquel arenal? Dime si hay un estrecho y los barcos maltrechos por el vendaval. No me digas que no pillas el horizonte. Ojalá yo leí tu nombre en un cartel y aquí estoy con la necesidad de sobrevivir, de seguir en pie. Tiraré, 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 tiraré un collar sobre aquel tablero de ajedrez y por cábala adivinarás si te sobra amor